In this video, we're going to talk about functional components in React. Essentially, we're going to talk about the lifeblood of how all React applications will work. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how components work and implement a functional component to render a piece of UI to the screen. So this is all about using components to take away some of the nitty-gritty details of what we have learned thus far with React and JSX. So let's start by defining what a component is. The first thing to note is that a component can be broken down into a simple JavaScript function that takes an arbitrary amount of arguments or parameters called props. And props is short for properties. So essentially what this is a function that takes in an object that we call props. Okay, there's going to be plenty of time to talk about props in the coming days. We really exhaust this detail to you, so don't get too bogged down by the term props, but just know that it is short for properties and that all functional components in React will receive an object that React calls props. It's important to know that props, the term props is not arbitrary, but all of the data that can be found on props will be arbitrary. We can send as much data down as props as we'd like. And we're going to get through that. Today you're going to learn a little bit more about that. Components are encapsulated pieces of UI, meaning we have a compartmentalized piece of code that represents our user interface. And this is what's so great about functional components and components in React in general. You can take your markup, so your HTML, your styles, your CSS if you'd like, and your formal JavaScript logic, and combine these things together, these three disparate principles, into one compartmentalized piece of user interface. Okay? And this is what we're going to learn how to build today as we go throughout this discussion. Another thing is that while we are encapsulated, JS and markup, so JavaScript and our markup, so JavaScript and HTML and JSX, all will exist within a component. Styles can be a part of that component file as well, or styles can be defined in another area of your application. So if you want to use something that you're familiar with, like post or less, like a preprocessor or something like that, you can go ahead and use that with React. So just because some people do inline styles and styles inside of their application, inside of their components, does not mean that you have to do that. The bare minimum that we need from our component is some sort of function that returns JSX or markup. The other cool thing about components is that they don't actually have to be functions. We're going to learn in the coming modules that that React supports JavaScript ES6 class syntax. So those of us who are familiar with classes, we've gone through some of the curriculum material. Classes are a very important part of the JavaScript ecosystem, and they're baked into React as well. Right now, we're going to focus on functional component. So let's take a look and see what a component looks like in React. Simply put, a component is a defined piece of code that we set as a variable and then a function. So we declare a function by naming our component, whatever you would like to name it. It can be my fancy button. It can be application header. For us, we're going to call it my first React component or some my element arbitrary name and example. Then the second thing to note is that this component will receive the props. Notice that as we're returning our JSX, our HTML-looking JavaScript, we're not doing anything with those props right now. That will come in future lessons. So right now, we just want you to focus on this simple fact, that a component can be represented as a function that returns some JSX. So all of our components need to return some JSX. Okay? And remember, this JSX is going to get converted through that React.createElement function. And eventually that's exactly how React is going to receive this code, and it's going to take it and say, oh, I need to add this to the DOM in whatever place that the user is specifying. Okay? So a function that returns some JSX. Now let's actually dive in and let's see what it's like to write a component. If you remember, we sort of built this little app. This one's even more simple than the one that we kind of all put together. It's just a simple div with the class name of heading that wraps an h1 that says hello world. There's no styles or anything fancy about it. If I inspect the element, you will see that we are getting exactly what we expect to be getting inside of the console. A div that wraps our h1 tag, and on that div we have a class of heading which is defined right here on the class name. So if a component is a function that returns some sort of HTML looking JavaScript or JSX, if we were to convert this over to a component, what are the processes, what are the steps that we would have to take to get there? Okay, let's go ahead and comment this one out. Don't follow along with me yet, just watch me do this. We have an example of us to follow along together as we write out a few basic components and put them together to build what we call our application. Okay, so remember that components are encapsulated pieces of UI. So they're encapsulated in a function. So on line 16 here, I'm going to declare my function as my element once again, or I'm actually going to change the name of it to my component. Okay? And I'm going to set that equal to a function that will receive props as an argument. React will supply this props argument to this function. For now, there's not going to be anything found on that, but we will show you how to access that toward the end of this lesson. So for now, all I'm going to simply do is console.log out our props so that we can see what is going on here under the hood. Okay. So now I'm going to return this stuff as opposed to returning, or as opposed to just setting it equal to an element or a variable. We're going to return this, and I have a typo here. We're going to return this div that is taking in an h1. Okay. So something to note here is that this would work if we had a single element that was being passed and no children. Okay, so let's kind of figure out what this is going to do. Let's actually go and refresh the page, and if you notice, nothing is being printed to the DOM, and in fact, we're getting a console error here inside of our console. So let's go peek at that, and let's go see what happened. Well, first things first, we actually did not define my element. So let's go in here, let's go refresh the page, make sure that it is what it's supposed to be. But if you notice this, we get this warning from React saying that we have something a little bit funky here. Okay, so functions are not valid as a React child. Okay, well, I just told you that we're going to be mounting a component to the DOM, and that components are functions. So here's the kicker. What we're doing is simply passing this function as a reference at this point. If we were to go and invoke this function, let's see what happens. If you notice, our div is being printed to the DOM, and then props is printing in the DOM as undefined. So right now, props is not defined because we're not passing anything as props to this component. Okay? So remember, our components are functions, and sometimes we can represent them as functions when we invoke them. But if we go back to that error, React is sort of giving us a hint as to what it is that we need to do to make this work and to make this work effectively. Well, remember, we are not using HTML here. We are using JSX. So because this is JSX, what we're going to do is we're actually going to treat this component as JSX. So if you notice, this is the warning, and if we read on, we can see what React is telling us right here. Functions are not valid as a React child. This may happen if you return a component instead of JSX-looking component from render. Now, render is this function right here. Remember, this comes from React DOM. Okay? Or maybe you meant to call this function rather than return it. So we called it, and we saw what happened when we just simply invoked the function. This statement was able to evaluate, and we were able to return JSX to our virtual DOM, which was then printed to the DOM in the hello world example. But now the other syntax and the more common syntax that you will see as you build React applications is to treat your components as JSX. And now we're about to start to see the power of this process. And if you notice, by simply treating this like JSX, all of a sudden our props object is defined. It's empty, but it's defined. Okay? All right. Now that we kind of know a little bit about components, let's learn some gotchas. Remember that this was traditionally wrapping the h1 tag here. So I'm going to finish this back to where we had it. Let's go and save and refresh. And things work nice and simple, okay? But as soon as we start to nest and get even more nest going on, we're going to run into a few problems. Number one, we're writing our HTML looking JavaScript in kind of a weird way. It's kind of all in line, when normally you kind of want to break it out into different lines, right? So this type of syntax is supported, but there's a caveat to it. If I actually save that and refresh it, yes, we might get this to work, but we actually want to clean it up a little bit by wrapping it in an evaluative statement inside of this function, just to clean things up a little bit, okay? So anytime you have nested components or nested items inside of your markup, you can now start to write this as if it was HTML, and you can write it in line and make sure that you wrap it in parentheses. When we get further into the React package Create React App, you'll see that this becomes a little bit more important to understand, because they will throw errors and you'll get a whole kind of mess of things. So for now, just know that all you need to do is wrap your nested HTML-looking JavaScript or JSX inside of these parentheses, and you should be good to go. Makes things nice and clean. Okay. Now I mentioned that before we stopped with the sort of lesson portion of this video, and we start coding along together, I would show you what props actually does here. Notice right now it's just an empty object. Okay. So if I wanted to pass something as props, I would define the property that I want passed on the left-hand side. Just like you would add an attribute to an HTML element, I am adding some arbitrary data to my component. And I'm going to set this equal to the string of Ryan. So now if I go and refresh the page, we can see that our props can start to fill up. And I can do this with as many things as I want. Age equals a number, and we'll just say that I am 31. And for whatever reason, it wants me to put that in brackets from my editor. And if you notice, I'm filling up this props object. So this is how properties are passed down to components. We're going to have a whole lecture conversation about this, so don't worry about it too much right now. But this is how you start to make things really reusable. Okay? And while this is really cool, this is really awesome, but we're just simply rendering one single component. What if I took these h1 tags, and instead of printing 2, we'll just print 1. But what if I wanted to come out and abstract this component away? Okay, well, I can actually build a component, and I'm going to call it my header, and we're going to build that right above here. Remember, it's just a function that receives props as an argument, and then we return some sort of JSX. In this case, just an h1 tag. And here is the kicker. Now, this is a component, so we can pass it inside of this other component. Now, inside, we're going to have a div with an h1 nested in between. Didn't mean to save that. I actually meant to hit refresh. And if you notice, nothing has changed, but under the hood, we can go and double check and see how things look. Meant to go to elements. We'll just try and inspect the element. And if you look, nothing virtually has changed here. The only thing that has changed is that we have abstracted this away from being an h1 tag nested in below. So you can do this as many times as you want now. We can add as many headers, and all of a sudden our application is a bunch of h1 tags that we have for use over and over again. Okay? I'm going to take this one step further, and it's going to hint towards something you're about to learn about. And I'm going to take some of this stuff. We don't need this information here. I'm going to delete this console log or just move it above. And now on my header, I'm going to say that what I want to do is print some sort of message and say that that message is going to be hello world. And then instead of rendering out our hello world text here, I'm going to render out the object's value found at props.message. Okay? And this is something that you're going to see more and more about, so don't get too hung up on it. But I can delete most of these, and I can go and refresh the page, and virtually nothing has changed, except if we inspect the console, we look at our props. Okay, let's go and clear that. So we're getting this message that says hello world. Let's go and add a couple more of these, but let's change, and we will Oi mundo, we'll change this to a different language. That's Portuguese. And I don't know many other languages. Hola, I think mundo is probably the same thing. Spanish. If you notice, we have 3 components receiving 3 different messages and printing those messages out. Okay. All right. That is just to show you the power of components and what we're going to be learning about in the next section. It's going to be really, really fun. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to follow along and we're going to build this little project together. So if you head over to your previous example that you were working with that has React and Babel installed, and you go ahead and you get back to that example, we're actually going to be creating a few components that we can put together. So go ahead and pause the video. Take your time to get set up. Make sure you have your react.html or your HTML file up and running, and we will rally together. If you notice, I have a bunch of errors now. This is no longer a component. But yeah, go ahead and stop listening to me, get your stuff ready, and then unpause, and we will meet back. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to begin by just simply converting this again back over to a functional component. Okay, so I'm going to actually just delete this whole thing, and I'm going to say const hello component equals a function that takes in props and renders some sort of message. Hello from React component land. Okay. And we can now pass this to my element, or to the render method. Save that and refresh the page, and if you see, our message has changed here. So really this is it. This is the basic of most basic components out there, just some sort of function that returns some JSX. And remember, with an arrow function, it's as if inside of here we have a return keyword placed in. This is an implicit return on this function here. Okay? So let's take this a step further, and let's actually create an app component that's going to encapsulate all of our other basic components that we build. Because we're going to build out an application, we're not just going to build out a bunch of flat static components. We're going to say const app equals a function that returns some sort of div. Okay? And that div is going to we can just put some placeholder in there now, but actually what we'll do is we'll just render out hello component instead, and then we're going to pass our app to our render function and watch it do its magic. So we're about to now see how this kind of comes to life. Okay? If I refresh the page, save, I have a problem. It does not like my semicolon. Okay. All right, so as long as you got this going, your app is now wrapping your Hello component. You're right on target. So make sure that that's what's happening now. So we're going to fill this in with a bunch of cool components. So let's build a few buttons, or just a button potentially. And we're going to do this between app and between Hello components, so make sure you give yourself some breathing room. Type out const my button equals, and we're going to return a button whose text is going to be click this button. And now inside of our component, inside of our app component, my button can live. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. Hooray, we got ourselves a little HTML button. So I want to take the time to stop and start to think about this idea of composability. Composability is probably my favorite term when it comes to software development. In real life, the term composability, when we think about it, we can think of some real-world examples of where we can see some composition happening. A lot of people, when I ask, when do you see this word in the real world, bring up the idea of some sort of symphony or an orchestra. Imagine that you are the conductor of this orchestra, and you're also writing the piece that all the instruments in the orchestra play. Now, you didn't design or build the instruments, right? You're just taking those instruments and the sounds that they play and the notes, and you're composing them together into this beautiful orchestrated, composed symphony, right? And each piece in and of themselves may be beautiful, but as you compartmentalize and take those small components of that symphony and compose them together in this large piece, you get something much more beautiful, okay? That is not much different than what we are doing here. What we are doing is we are taking a very short, beautiful, succinct piece of code and putting it together inside of another piece of code. You're orchestrating, you're composing out this idea, okay? And this is kind of how we're going to build stuff for the next couple of weeks. This is the pattern that you're going to use. You're going to write functions, whether they be in this file together or in a completely separate file in a different part of your application. You're going to write those functions, and they're going to be composed together and work for you. So we can do this with more things. More DOM elements can be composed in this manner. If I go and say my input now equals props that returns some sort of input field, we can just say input, and we can say this input will have a type of text, and we'll say placeholder for this input equals I am an input. Okay? And now if we add this beautiful little input into our component tree, into our composed app, we should be able to go refresh the page and see our input in line with our button. Super important things to note here is that yes, we are importing and pulling in 3 components to our little application here, and app is the only thing that's getting passed to render. So this app component will be fed into our render function and eventually be fed into this root ID here. Okay, I'm realizing now that it's capitalized, but oh well. Don't really want to capitalize your IDs often. Okay? And this is how we make things work. So this is where we get a chance to kind of see the power of React and see it all come together. So now I want you to take the time to do this on your own. I want you to build out a few components and see how far you can take it. Add some class names to your button. For example, if I wanted to add a class name here to this button and I wanted to say my fancy button, I could then take that and add a style tag to my element here inside of the head and say inside of a style, we're going to select my fancy button and change the background of our button to periwinkle or something. We'll go pale green. We'll say that the height of our button now is 30 pixels high. Line height is about 15 pixels. Maybe that pushes it around. I'm not sure. But then we'll say our width is about 175 pixels. And we have this beautiful now little fancy button that is kind of looking nice. And we could take this and take it a step further. Border radius. And we could say that's a border radius of, say, I don't know, 6 or 7 pixels. And it's going to start rounding it off into a little button. And you could take that as far as you'd like. So I want you to start putting components together over the next 15-20 minutes. Build out a few pieces of composed components that you're going to build from scratch. Okay. And the cool thing is that this afternoon or tomorrow afternoon, whenever you get into your afternoon assignment, this is the bulk of what you need to know. Components that we put together, we can style out and work all together. And we have some design files for you to match. But for now, your challenge is to sort of recreate this behavior from scratch and build us a little application that potentially has your username or your name, maybe a link to a GitHub handle or something. And you can start to build your little application from scratch. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great time. We will talk to you later.